Sometimes the people who save us disappear before we can even say thank you. And sometimes, years later, they walk back into our lives when we least expect it. Caleb Stone has lived alone in the Wyoming mountains for 15 years, asking nothing from anyone. One cold November evening, he finds a woman collapsed near his fence. He brings her inside, expecting she'll leave by morning. She doesn't. Days pass in quiet companionship until she turns to him and asks, "Can you be my wife?" Those words shake something loose in his memory. He doesn't know her hands, once pulled him back from death, in a place he's tried to forget. Will the truth bring them together or tear them apart? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory in November of 1882 was not a forgiving place. The wind came down from the peaks like the breath of something ancient and indifferent, carrying with it the promise of a hard winter. Up in the high country, where the pine trees grew thick and the air thinned enough to make a man's lungs work for every breath, Caleb Stone had built himself a life that asked nothing of the world and expected nothing in return. His cabin sat in a small clearing he'd carved from the wilderness 15 years ago, when he'd first come to these mountains with nothing but a pack on his back and a need to disappear. The structure was solid, built from lodgepole pine he'd felled himself, chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney that drew smoke clean and true. A covered porch ran along the front, facing east, so he could watch the sunrise when sleep failed him, which it often did. The homestead wasn't much by most standards. A small barn housed his mare, Copper, and a milk cow he'd named Bess, for no particular reason, except that she'd looked like a Bess when he'd bought her. A chicken coop provided eggs most mornings. A root cellar dug into the hillside kept potatoes, carrots, and preserved meat through the long months when the snow came up past the porch rail. A creek ran cold and clear 50 yards from his door, never freezing entirely, even in the deepest part of winter. Caleb had turned 43 that autumn, though he'd let the day pass without acknowledgement. He was a tall man, just over 6 feet, with shoulders that still carried the breadth of his younger years, despite the lean times. His hair had gone mostly grey, which he kept trimmed short with a pair of shears when it got in his eyes. His face was weathered like old leather, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth, marked by years of squinting into sun and wind. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a pale line through his beard that he'd stopped noticing long ago. His hands were what told the real story. They were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked with them all his life, but they moved with a precision that spoke of training most men never received. When he skinned a deer or repaired a harness or loaded his rifle, every motion was economical, practiced, efficient. These were not the hands of a man who'd spent his whole life in the mountains, despite what a stranger might assume. The truth was that Caleb Stone had been someone else before he'd become a mountain hermit. He'd been Sergeant Caleb Stone of the United States Army, a scout and tracker who'd served in the border conflicts that most people back east preferred not to think about. He'd been good at his work, maybe too good. His company had called him Phantom because he could move through hostile territory like smoke. There and gone before the enemy knew to look for him. That life had ended one brutal day near the Mexican border when his patrol had been ambushed. He remembered the chaos, the gunfire, the screaming of horses and men. He remembered going down hard, pain exploding through his chest and side. He remembered thinking with a strange clarity that this was how it ended. What came after was fragmented, confused. Fever dreams and darkness. Hands touching him gently. A woman's voice, soft and determined. Water on his lips. The smell of herbs and something clean, like soap. Then nothing for a long time. When he'd finally woken fully, he'd been in an army hospital 200 miles from where he'd fallen. The doctors told him he'd been brought in by locals, that he'd been delirious for weeks, that he was lucky to be alive. They couldn't tell him much more than that. The locals who'd found him had disappeared before anyone thought to get their names. His company was gone. All of them. He was the only survivor. and he carried that weight like stones in his pockets. The army had offered him an honorable discharge and a pension. He'd taken both and headed north, looking for a place where the past couldn't follow. He'd found this mountain, this clearing, this silence. 15 years had passed since then. 15 years of solitude, broken only by monthly trips down to Redemption Ridge, the small town that squatted in the valley below. He'd go in for supplies, spend as little time as possible making small talk, and head back up the mountain before anyone could ask too many questions. The townspeople had learned to accept him as one of those peculiar mountain men who preferred the company of trees to people. Some thought him unfriendly. Some thought him strange. A few, like Sheriff Tom Brennan, knew enough of his past to understand that some men needed distance from the world to stay sane. Tom had served in the same conflict, though in a different unit. They'd crossed paths a few times, shared a campfire or two. When Tom had pinned on the sheriff's badge in Redemption Ridge, he'd made a point of letting Caleb know there was a friend in town, if he ever needed one. Caleb appreciated it, even if he'd never taken Tom up on the offer. Martha Hayes, who ran the general store, was another friendly face. She was a widow woman in her 60s, sharp as a tack and kind as Sunday morning. She never pried, never pushed, but she always had his order ready when he came to town and sometimes slipped an extra tin of coffee or a newspaper into his saddlebag when she thought he wasn't looking. These small connections were enough for Caleb. He didn't need more. He'd learned to find peace in routine, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the work of keeping himself alive and the homestead running. His days followed a pattern that rarely varied. Wake before dawn, build up the fire, make coffee strong enough to strip paint. Feed the animals, milk Bess, collect eggs. Spend the morning on whatever needed doing. Cutting wood, mending fence, checking his traps, hunting if the larder was low. Afternoon was for maintenance, for the 100 small tasks that kept a man alive in the high country. Evening was for a simple meal, for sitting on the porch if the weather allowed, for watching the light fade from the sky. He read by lamplight most nights. He had a small collection of books, read and reread, until he knew whole passages by heart. Homer, Virgil, some Shakespeare, a few novels. The words kept his mind sharp, kept him connected to something larger than just survival. He didn't think of himself as lonely. Loneliness implied wanting something he didn't have. He'd made his choice, and he lived with it. But on that cold November evening, when he rode back from checking his trapline along the northern ridge, everything changed. The sun was dropping fast behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature was falling with it, promising frost by morning. Caleb was thinking about supper, about the venison stew he had simmering in the pot, about maybe reading another chapter of the Odyssey before bed. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth caught on his fence line, but as Copper drew closer, he realized it was a person. A woman collapsed in the dirt, one hand still clutching the top rail, as if she'd been trying to pull herself up. When her strength had finally given out, Caleb was off his horse before he'd fully registered the decision to dismount. His hand went to the pistol at his hip out of instinct, but he didn't draw it. The woman wasn't moving, and there was no one else in sight. He knelt beside her, his knees protesting after a long day in the saddle. She was face down in the dirt, her dark hair spilling across her shoulders, her dress torn and muddy. He reached out carefully and touched her shoulder. She was warm. Alive then. He turned her over gently and his breath caught. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with a face that would have been striking if it wasn't pale with exhaustion and streaked with dirt. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. No obvious wounds that he could see, but her hands were scraped raw, and her dress was torn in several places. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. Caleb made a decision. He couldn't leave her here. Whether she was running from something or just lost, she wouldn't last the night in the cold. He'd get her inside, make sure she wasn't dying, and figure out the rest in the morning. He gathered her up carefully, surprised by how light she was, and lifted her into his arms. She made a small sound but didn't wake. He whistled for Copper, who followed him back to the cabin without needing to be led. The fire had burned low while he'd been gone. He kicked the door open, carried the woman inside, and laid her carefully on his bed, the only bed in the cabin. He'd sleep on the floor or in the chair if needed. He built up the fire until it roared, filling the cabin with warmth. Then he lit the lamps and turned his attention to his unexpected guest. Her dress was ruined, but that mattered less than making sure she was all right. He checked her pulse, which was steady. Her breathing evened out as the warmth reached her. He cleaned the dirt from her face and hands with a damp cloth, gently, like he'd tend to an injured animal. That's when he noticed her looking at him. Her eyes were open, dark and deep, watching him with an intensity that made him freeze. She didn't seem afraid, which struck him as odd. Most women would be terrified waking up in a strange man's cabin in the middle of nowhere. Instead, she looked at him like she recognized him. "You," she whispered, her voice rough from exhaustion. "You're alive." Then her eyes closed again, and she was asleep before he could ask her what she meant. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair by the fire, his rifle across his knees, watching the woman sleep and listening to the sounds of the mountain. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind against the shutters made his hand drift toward the rifle's stock. Old instincts died hard, and a stranger in his cabin, no matter how helpless she appeared, was cause for caution. She slept deeply, her breathing slow and even. In the lamplight he could see her more clearly now. She had a fine-boned face, elegant even in exhaustion. Her hands, though scraped and dirty, were delicate, with long fingers that suggested she'd never done hard labor. Her dress, beneath the mud and tears, had once been quality fabric, the kind that cost real money. This was no frontier woman used to hardship, so what was she doing collapsed on his fence line, 20 miles from the nearest settlement? Dawn came slow and cold. Caleb made coffee, the smell filling the cabin with a familiar comfort. He was pouring his second cup when he heard her stir. She sat up slowly, wincing as her body protested the movement. Her eyes found him immediately, and for a long moment they just looked at each other across the small space of the cabin. "You brought me inside," she said. "It wasn't a question. Couldn't leave you in the cold," Caleb replied, his voice rough from disuse. "You were near frozen." She looked around the cabin, taking in the simple furnishings, the weapons on the wall, the books stacked on a rough-hewn shelf. Her gaze lingered on the coffee pot. "May I?" she asked. He poured her a cup and brought it to her. She wrapped her hands around it like it was precious, breathing in the steam before taking a careful sip. She closed her eyes and something in her expression eased. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You got a name?" Caleb asked, returning to his chair. "Elena," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Elena Vasquez. I'm Caleb Stone. This is my land." "I know," she said, then seemed to catch herself. I assumed. There's no other homestead for miles." He let that pass for now. "What were you doing out there, Elena Vasquez?" "That's a long walk from anywhere." Her hands tightened on the cup. "I was traveling. Got separated from my party. It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth." Caleb had spent enough years reading men's faces in high-stakes situations to know when someone was holding back. But he didn't push. "Not yet. Where were you headed?" "North," she said. "Just north. Running from something or running to something?" Her eyes met his, and he saw the fear there, carefully controlled but real. "Does it matter?" "Might," he said. "If whatever you're running from decides to come looking, I'd like to know what I'm dealing with." She was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Bad men," she said. "Men who won't stop looking until they find me." "What did you do?" "I saw something I shouldn't have seen." She looked up at him. "And I took something to protect myself. Evidence, insurance, I thought. But it only made things worse." Caleb considered this. "The law involved?" "The law won't help," she said with a bitter smile. "The man looking for me has the law in his pocket. Has everything in his pocket in 3 counties. You got a plan. Keep moving. Get far enough away that he stops looking." She set down the cup. "I'll leave in the morning. I won't bring trouble to your door." "You're in no shape to travel," Caleb said, and it was true. She was exhausted, probably hadn't eaten properly in days, and from the way she moved, she was nursing injuries beyond the scraped hands. "You can stay until you're stronger. Few days, maybe." Suspicion flickered across her face. "Why would you do that?" "Because leaving you to die sits poorly with me," he said simply. "I'm not much for company, but I'm not a man who turns away someone in need." She studied him for a long moment. And again, he had that strange feeling that she was seeing more than just his face, that she was looking at something deeper. "All right," she said finally. "A few days, then I'll go." "We'll see," was all he said. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Elena proved to be more capable than her refined appearance suggested. Despite Caleb's protests that she should rest, she insisted on helping around the cabin. She cooked, which was a revelation because Caleb's cooking ran toward the functional rather than the pleasant. She cleaned, organized, mended his spare shirt where it had torn. She moved through his space with a quiet efficiency that didn't intrude on his habits, but somehow made the cabin feel less empty. They didn't talk much at first. Caleb wasn't used to conversation, and Elena seemed content with silence. But slowly, in the way of people forced into proximity, they began to share small pieces of themselves. She told him she'd been a nurse in Santa Fe, working at a hospital there. She'd left after trouble she didn't specify, headed north looking for a fresh start. She was educated, that much was clear. She spoke Spanish and English with equal fluency, and once he caught her reading one of his books in Latin, her lips moving silently over the words. He told her about the mountain, about building the cabin, about the rhythms of life in the high country. He didn't talk about the war, and she didn't ask, though sometimes he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't read. On the third evening, after a simple supper of venison and beans, they sat by the fire while the wind howled outside. Elena had been quiet all day, and Caleb sensed she was working up to something. Finally, she turned to him, her face serious in the firelight. "Caleb," she said, and the use of his first name startled him. "I need to ask you something." "All right," she took a breath, seemed to steady herself. "Can you be my wife?" The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that for a moment Caleb thought he'd misheard. "What?" Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I'm sorry. I mean, can I be your wife? Will you marry me?" He stared at her, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Elena, let me explain," she said quickly. "I know how this sounds. But listen, those men looking for me, they won't stop. I can't run forever. But if I'm married, if I have a husband, if I have a legitimate claim to being somewhere, it becomes harder for them. And you're clearly a man who values his privacy, who doesn't want questions. A wife explains a woman being here. It protects us both. A marriage of convenience," Caleb said slowly. "Yes, an arrangement. I would continue to help around the homestead. You would have someone to share the work. And I would have protection, a name, a reason to be here." She clasped her hands together. "I know I'm asking a great deal, but I have nowhere else to go, and you're the first person in a very long time who's shown me kindness without wanting something in return." Caleb stood up, needing to move, to think. He walked to the window and stared out at the darkness. A marriage, a wife. After 15 years of solitude, of careful distance from everyone and everything, she was asking him to bind himself to a woman he barely knew. The practical part of his mind saw the sense in it. The homestead could use another pair of hands. The arrangement would discourage questions from townsfolk. And if these men were truly dangerous, having her here as his wife would at least give him some legal standing to protect her. But there was another part of him. A part he'd thought long dead, that stirred at the idea of not being alone, of having someone to talk to share meals with, to hear moving around the cabin, of waking up and knowing another person was there. It was that part that scared him most. "What about after?" he asked, not turning around. "Say these men give up looking. Say you're safe. Then what?" "Then we can end the arrangement if you wish," she said quietly. "I would understand. This isn't a real marriage I'm proposing. Just a practical solution to a problem." He turned to face her. She sat very straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the hope she was trying not to show. "I need to think on it," he said. "Of course." She stood. "I'll leave you be." She retreated to the sleeping area he'd partitioned off for her with a hung blanket, leaving him alone with the fire and his thoughts. Caleb sat back down, his mind churning. Every instinct he'd honed over 15 years of solitude screamed at him to say no, to send her on her way as soon as she was strong enough to travel, to return to his ordered, quiet life. But something else pulled at him, something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the loneliness he'd never admitted to feeling. Maybe it was the way she looked at him sometimes, like she saw past the scars and the silence to something worth knowing. Maybe it was just that for the first time in a very long time, his cabin felt like more than just a place to exist. He thought about it all through the night, weighing risks and benefits, examining his own motivations with the same careful attention he'd once used to read enemy territory. By dawn, he'd made his decision. Elena was already up when he emerged from his room, making coffee as if she'd done it 100 times. She looked at him, her expression cautious and hopeful in equal measure. "I'll do it," Caleb said without preamble. "But we need to be clear about the terms. This is an arrangement, like you said. Separate sleeping areas, no expectations beyond what we've agreed to. And if either of us wants out, we talk about it honestly. No deceit." Relief flooded her face, so intense it was almost painful to see. "Yes, of course. Whatever terms you want. We'll need to go to town, make it legal. Sheriff Brennan can witness. When? Soon as you're ready to ride. Maybe tomorrow, if the weather holds." She nodded, then crossed the room and held out her hand. "Thank you, Caleb. You won't regret this." He took her hand, meaning to shake it, but instead found himself holding it for a moment longer than necessary. Her skin was warm, her grip firm, and something in her touch felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain, like an echo of something he'd forgotten. That night, as Caleb checked the perimeter before bed, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Tracks in the soft earth near the southern edge of his property. Horse tracks, fresh within the last few hours. Multiple riders, moving slow like they were searching for something or someone. He erased the tracks as best he could and headed back to the cabin, his hand on his pistol. Whatever was coming, it would be here soon. And now, whether he'd intended it or not, he was committed to standing between Elena and whoever was hunting her. Inside, he found a small silver locket on the table where Elena had been sitting. She must have taken it out while he was outside. He picked it up, meaning to return it to her, but the clasp was loose and it fell open in his hand. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, Elena, perhaps 10 years younger, and something else. A small piece of fabric, stained dark with what looked like old blood. He closed the locket quickly and set it back down, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the cold wind outside. Who was this woman, really? And why did he feel like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't see? Something that would change everything once he understood it. He had no answers, only questions, and the growing certainty that his quiet life was about to become considerably more complicated. Morning brought a sky the color of old steel, and a bite in the air that promised snow before week's end. Caleb woke before dawn, as always, but this time there was the soft sound of another person breathing in the cabin, and it made him pause in the darkness, listening. Strange how quickly the mind could adjust to another presence, even after so many years alone. He rose quietly and built up the fire, then slipped outside to check on the animals. The tracks he'd seen the night before were gone, covered by wind and his own efforts, but the knowledge of them sat heavy in his gut. Someone had been watching his property. Someone was looking. When he returned to the cabin, Elena was awake, dressed in the spare clothes he'd managed to piece together for her from his own things and an old shirt that had belonged to his father. The clothes were too large, but she'd cinched them with a belt and rolled the sleeves, and somehow she made even that look dignified. "I saw you checking the perimeter," she said quietly. "You found something last night." He nodded, no point in lying. "Tracks. Multiple riders, probably 3 or 4. They didn't come close to the cabin, but they were searching. Her face paled slightly, but she didn't panic. "How long do you think we have?" "Hard to say. Could be they'll move on, could be they'll come back with more men. Either way, I need to know what we're dealing with." He poured coffee and handed her a cup. "And I need to let the sheriff know. Tom Brennan's a good man. If there's trouble coming, he should be aware. You're going to town today?" "We both are. We have business to attend to, remember?" Understanding crossed her face. The marriage. In the tension of the moment, she'd almost forgotten. "Right, yes. You up for the ride? It's 3 hours, maybe more in this cold. I can manage." They ate a quick breakfast of cornbread and bacon, then Caleb saddled Copper and the smaller mare he kept for packing supplies. Elena proved to be a capable rider, sitting the horse with ease, despite her exhaustion. Another piece that didn't quite fit with her story. How many nurses in Santa Fe learned to ride like they'd grown up doing it. The ride down the mountain was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The trail was narrow in places, winding through stands of pine and aspen, past rock faces that dropped away into nothing. Caleb led the way, constantly scanning the landscape with eyes that never stopped moving. Old habits, military habits coming back like they'd never left. Redemption Ridge sat in a valley where 2 creeks met, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a single main street. It wasn't much. A general store, a saloon, a church, a handful of houses, the sheriff's office, and a courthouse that also served as the mayor's office and meeting hall. Maybe 100 souls called it home, and most of them made their living from ranching or timber. It was mid-morning when they rode in, and the street was quiet. A few heads turned as they passed, curious eyes taking in the sight of Caleb Stone with a woman riding beside him. Caleb ignored the looks and headed straight for the sheriff's office. Tom Brennan was at his desk when they walked in, paperwork spread in front of him. He was a solid man in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and a weathered face that had seen its share of trouble. When he looked up and saw Caleb, surprise flickered across his features, followed quickly by concern. "Caleb," Tom said, standing, "wasn't expecting to see you until supply day." His eyes moved to Elena. "And you've brought company. Tom, this is Elena Vasquez." "Elena, Sheriff Tom Brennan." Tom nodded politely, his lawman's eyes taking in everything, her borrowed clothes, her careful posture, the wariness in her expression. "Ma'am." "Sheriff," Elena said quietly. "We need to talk," Caleb said. "Private would be best." Tom gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Have a seat. I'll put the coffee on." Once they were settled with cups in hand, Caleb laid it out simply and directly. Elena was in trouble. Men were looking for her. They might be dangerous. He was going to marry her and provide protection, but he wanted Tom aware of the situation, in case things turned violent. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Caleb finished, the sheriff turned to Elena. "These men who are after you, ma'am, what exactly did you witness?" Elena hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "A murder. I saw a man kill another man in cold blood, and I took documents that prove he's been stealing from his business partners, running illegal operations across the border. The man is Dalton Cross." Tom's expression darkened. "Cross, I know that name. He's got holdings in New Mexico, connections all the way to the territorial governor. That's why I ran," Elena said. "No local law would touch him. He's too powerful, has too many men on his payroll. And these documents you took, you still have them." "Hidden, safe," Tom rubbed his jaw, thinking. "This is above my authority, you understand. A killing in New Mexico, even if you could prove it, that's not my jurisdiction. But if Cross sends men into my county to cause trouble, that's a different matter." He looked at Caleb. "You're sure about this? About taking this on?" "I'm sure. Marriage won't necessarily protect her if Cross is determined enough. It's a start. And it'll give me legal standing to defend her." Tom nodded slowly. "All right then. Let's make it official. Judge Morrison is at the courthouse. I'll stand witness." He looked at Elena with something like sympathy. "You understand what you're asking of this man, ma'am? Caleb's lived peacefully up on that mountain for a long time. This could bring serious trouble to his door." "I know," Elena said quietly. "And if there was any other way, I'd take it." But there isn't. Fair enough. Tom stood. Let's get you married. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, conducted in the courthouse by Judge Morrison, an elderly man with kind eyes who asked no questions beyond the legal necessities. Tom and Martha Hayes, who'd been fetched from the general store, stood as witnesses. Martha had brought a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers she'd pressed between pages of a book, and she pressed them into Elena's hands with a smile. Every bride should have flowers, Martha said firmly. The words were simple, the vows standard. Caleb found himself speaking them with more feeling than he'd expected, his voice steady but not entirely calm. When it came time for the ring, he pulled out a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, the only piece of jewelry he owned. Elena's eyes widened when she saw it, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But she held steady, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. You may kiss the bride, Judge Morrison said with a small smile. Caleb hesitated, then leaned in and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Elena's lips. It was barely a touch over almost before it began, but he felt something shift between them in that moment, something that went beyond the practical arrangement they'd agreed to. Afterward, Martha insisted on providing a small meal at her house behind the general store. It was a simple affair, bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apple pie, but it was served with such genuine warmth that Caleb felt his throat tighten. He hadn't been shown this kind of uncomplicated kindness in a very long time. You're a lucky man, Caleb Stone, Martha said, patting his arm. And you, dear, she turned to Eleanor, you've married yourself a good one. He may be quiet as a stone, but there's not a more decent man in this territory. I'm beginning to see that, Elena said softly, and when she looked at Caleb, there was something in her eyes that made him look away. Uncomfortable with the intensity of it, they stayed in town only as long as necessary. Caleb bought extra supplies, ammunition, preserved goods, fabric for Elena to make proper clothes, and loaded everything onto the pack mare. People stared, whispered, but no one approached except to offer brief congratulations. As they prepared to leave, Tom pulled Caleb aside one last time. I asked around while you were at Martha's, the sheriff said quietly. Seems there were some rough-looking men through here 2 days ago, asking about a woman traveling alone. Described someone matching Elena's appearance. I told them I hadn't seen anyone like that. Caleb's jaw tightened. They say where they were headed. North. Same direction as your mountain. Tom's eyes were serious. You need to be careful, Caleb. If these are Cross's men, they're not going to give up easy. And there's only so much I can do if they decide to come after her on private property. I know. I'll handle it. I'm sure you will. But if you need help, you send word. I'll come, and I'll bring men I trust. Caleb gripped the sheriff's hand. Appreciate it, Tom. That's what friends are for. The ride back up the mountain seemed longer, heavier, with unspoken thoughts. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of coming snow. They'd have to hurry to beat the weather home. Elena rode beside him in silence for most of the journey, but as they neared the final approach to the cabin, she spoke. Your mother's ring, she said. You didn't have to give me something so precious. She would have wanted it used, Caleb said. No point in it sitting in a box. Still, thank you. They arrived at the cabin as the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and lazy in the fading light. Caleb took care of the horses, while Elena carried the supplies inside. By the time he joined her, she had a fire going and coffee brewing, the cabin warming quickly. That night they sat together by the fire, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than cautious. They were married now, bound by law, if not by love. It changed things in ways Caleb was still trying to understand. What was she like? Eleanor asked suddenly. Your mother? Caleb considered the question. He didn't talk about his family much, but something about the evening, about the strange intimacy of the situation loosened his tongue. Strong, he said finally. She had to be. My father died when I was young, and she raised me and my brother alone on a small farm in Missouri. Never complained, never showed weakness, just did what needed doing. He paused. She taught me that strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. He looked at Elena. What about your family? Her expression shuttered slightly. My father was a doctor in Mexico City. My mother was from a good family. They died when I was 16. Yellow fever. After that, I went to live with an aunt in Santa Fe, and she helped me train as a nurse. No siblings. Her brother, younger, he died in the same epidemic. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Caleb heard the pain beneath it. I'm the only one left. They sat with that for a while, two people alone in the world, bound together by circumstance and necessity. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the mountain in white, erasing the tracks of anyone who might have been watching. The snow continued through the night and into the next day, transforming the mountain into a landscape of pure white silence. Caleb woke to find Elena already up, standing at the window watching the snowfall with an expression he couldn't quite read. In the morning light, wearing one of his old shirts and a skirt Martha had given her, his mother's ring on her finger, she looked like she belonged here in a way that unsettled him. Never seen snow like this, she said without turning around. In Santa Fe we got some, but nothing like this. It's beautiful. It's dangerous, Caleb said, joining her at the window. We're cut off now until it melts or packs down enough to travel. Could be days, could be weeks. Are we prepared? We'll be fine. Got plenty of supplies, the animals are sheltered, wood stacked high. We won't starve or freeze. He looked at her. But we're alone up here. Just us. I know. She met his eyes. Is that a problem? No, he said, realizing it was true. No, it's not. The days that followed developed their own rhythm, different from before. They were married now, legally bound, and that changed the dynamic in ways both subtle and profound. Elena no longer moved through the cabin like a guest, tentative and careful. She rearranged things to make them more efficient, added small touches that made the space feel more like a home than a shelter. A vase with dried flowers on the table, curtains she'd sewn from spare fabric, the books organized by subject rather than size. Caleb found he didn't mind. In fact, he discovered he liked coming in from morning chores to find coffee already made and breakfast waiting. He liked having someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who could discuss the books he read and offer perspectives he'd never considered. He liked not being alone. It scared him how much he liked it. Elena proved to be more capable than he'd expected in other ways, too. She could shoot. Not well, but competently. When he took her out to practice with his rifle, she handled the weapon with a confidence that spoke of prior training. Where did you learn? He asked, watching her reload. My father taught me. He believed women should know how to protect themselves. She lined up another shot, squeezed the trigger, hit the target dead center. He was right. Caleb showed her the basics of tracking, of reading the forest, of understanding how to move quietly when necessary. She learned quickly, her attention sharp, her questions intelligent. It was more than idle curiosity. She was preparing herself for something, though she didn't say what. At night, they maintained their separate sleeping areas, but the partition between them felt increasingly arbitrary. They talked late into the evening, sharing stories carefully edited to avoid the deepest wounds. She told him about nursing, about the strange satisfaction of helping someone heal. He told her about the mountains, about the animals he'd tracked, about the harsh beauty of winter storms. They didn't talk about the men who might be hunting her. They didn't talk about what would happen when the snow melted and the world came back. They existed in a bubble of time, isolated and strangely peaceful, but Elena had nightmares. Caleb would wake to hear her crying out in her sleep, words in Spanish too fast and frightened for him to follow. The first time it happened, he lay still uncertain. The second time, he got up and went to her. She was sitting up in bed, her face pale, her hands shaking. He sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, not touching her but close enough that she could reach him if she needed to. You're safe, he said quietly. Whatever you dreamed, it's not real. You're here and you're safe. She looked at him, her eyes wide and dark. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and pressed her face against his shoulder, her hands gripping his shirt. He froze for a moment, then slowly, carefully put his arms around her. She didn't cry. She just held onto him like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. And he held her back, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest, feeling something crack open inside him that he'd kept locked away for a very long time. "I'm sorry," she whispered eventually. "I don't mean to be weak." "You're not weak," he said. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." She pulled back enough to look at him. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." For a long moment they just looked at each other. Then, moving slowly enough that she could stop him if she wanted to, Caleb leaned forward and kissed her. Not the brief, formal kiss of their wedding, but something real, something that spoke of the feelings he'd been trying to ignore. Elena responded immediately, her hands coming up to frame his face, her lips soft and warm against his. The kiss deepened, became something more urgent, and Caleb felt himself falling into it, into her, into the possibility of something he'd thought was lost to him forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena rested her forehead against his. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "I know. The arrangement was supposed to be practical, simple. I know that too. So what do we do?" Caleb drew back enough to meet her eyes. "We figure it out as we go. No expectations, no pressure. We just see where this leads." She nodded slowly. "All right, we see where it leads." He kissed her once more, gently, then stood to return to his own bed. But her hand caught his. "Stay," she said. "Just for tonight. I don't want to be alone." So he stayed, lying beside her on top of the blankets, and eventually they both fell asleep that way, closer than they'd been, but not crossing lines neither was ready to cross. It felt right, in a way that defied the practical arrangement they'd made. It felt like the beginning of something real. The next morning brought clarity of a different sort. Caleb was checking the snares he'd set near the cabin when he found fresh tracks in the snow. Boot prints, several sets, coming from the south and circling the property at a distance. Someone had been watching them during the night. His blood ran cold. The snow should have protected them, should have made travel difficult enough to keep searchers away. But someone had come anyway, and they'd been careful about it, professional, military maybe, or experienced trackers. He followed the tracks for a quarter-mile before they disappeared into a rocky area where the snow couldn't accumulate. Whoever they were, they knew what they were doing. When he got back to the cabin, Elena took one look at his face and knew. "They're here," she said. "It wasn't a question. They were here. Last night while we slept." They didn't approach the cabin, just watched. How many? At least 4, maybe more. Hard to tell with the snow. Elena sank into a chair, her face pale. "I should leave. I should go before they come back with more men." "You're not going anywhere," Caleb said firmly. "We're married. You're under my protection. That means something. It means you could die trying to protect me from men who won't stop until they get what they want. Maybe. But I've faced worse odds." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. "You don't understand what Cross is capable of. He's ruthless. He doesn't care about the law or about innocent people. If he sent men here, they have orders to bring me back by any means necessary. And if you get in the way, then I get in the way." Caleb knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands. "Listen to me, Elena. I'm not some helpless farmer. I know how to fight. I know how to survive. And I know how to make this mountain work for us instead of against us. If Cross's men want a fight, they'll get one. But they won't get you." Tears filled her eyes. "Why? Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" "Because you saved my life once," a voice whispered in the back of his mind, though he didn't know where the thought came from. "Because looking at you feels like remembering something important I've forgotten." But what he said was simpler. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because—" He hesitated, then pressed forward. "Because you're not just an arrangement anymore. You're my wife, and I protect what's mine." A tear spilled down her cheek. "Caleb, we'll get through this," he said. "Together. I promise you that." She nodded, not quite believing but wanting to, and he pulled her close, holding her while she finally let herself cry, while the snow fell outside and somewhere on his mountain. Dangerous men planned their next move. That afternoon, Sheriff Brennan arrived on horseback, surprising them both. The ride up must have been brutal in the snow, but Tom looked determined rather than exhausted. "Figured you should know," the sheriff said, accepting coffee and warming himself by the fire. Those men came back through town. 5 of them this time, well armed, asking more pointed questions. "They know Elena's up here. They know you two got married. And they're not happy about it. Did they make threats?" Caleb asked. "Not directly. Too smart for that. But the implication was clear enough. They're planning something? When? Soon, I'd guess. Weather's supposed to break in a day or 2. They'll wait for the past to clear, then they'll come." Tom looked at Elena with sympathy. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I wish I could do more, but they haven't broken any laws I can prove. And Cross's reach extends into the territorial government. If I arrest his men without cause, I'll have officials breathing down my neck within a week." "I understand," Elena said quietly. "You've already done more than most would." Tom turned to Caleb. "You need help. You let me know. I can round up a few good men, deputies I trust. We can be here in half a day, once the weather clears." "I appreciate it." "Tom, I'll keep that in mind." After the sheriff left, fighting his way back down the mountain before dark, Caleb and Elena stood together at the window watching him go. The sun was setting, painting the snow gold and pink, beautiful and indifferent to the violence it might soon witness. "Tell me about the war," Elena said suddenly. "Tell me what you were really doing out there." Caleb was quiet for a long time. He didn't talk about the war, hadn't talked about it in 15 years. But she deserved to know who she'd married, what kind of man would be standing between her and Cross's hired guns. "I was a scout," he said finally, "part of a special unit that operated along the border. We tracked enemy movements, disrupted supply lines, gathered intelligence. It was dangerous work, the kind that didn't make it into official reports. And the ambush. We were tracking a group we'd been chasing for weeks. Got sloppy, too confident. They were waiting for us in a canyon, and when we rode in..." He stopped, the memories vivid even after all this time. "It was a slaughter. My whole unit gone in minutes. I took a bullet to the chest, another to the side. Went down hard, but you survived, barely. I remember bits and pieces, darkness, pain, someone touching me, but I thought it was death coming to collect." He looked at her. "Then I woke up in a hospital, and they told me locals had found me and brought me in. I never knew who. Never had a chance to thank them." Elena's hand found his, her fingers threading through his, with a familiarity that felt both new and ancient. "Maybe someday you will." "Maybe," he said, not understanding the weight in her voice, the way she looked at him like she was memorizing his face. That night, they slept in the same bed, not out of passion, but out of need for closeness, for comfort in the face of coming danger. Caleb held Elena against him, her head on his chest, listening to her breathe, and he thought about how strange it was that a month ago he'd been alone, content in his solitude, asking nothing of the world. Now he had a wife. Now he had something to lose, and he'd fight with everything he had to keep from losing it. Winter deepened its grip on the mountain as January arrived, and with it came a strange period of waiting. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained fierce, and the world felt suspended between what had been and what was coming. Caleb used the time to prepare, to turn his homestead into something that could be defended if necessary. He reinforced the cabin's shutters, added extra bars to the door. He stockpiled ammunition and positioned weapons strategically around the property. He mapped out sight lines and defensive positions, his military training coming back as naturally as breathing. Elena watched him work with a mixture of gratitude and guilt, knowing that every precaution he took was because of her. But they also lived. That was the strange thing. In the spaces between preparation and worry, they built something that felt remarkably like a real marriage. They cooked together, Elena teaching him recipes she'd learned from her mother while he showed her how to prepare game. They read together in the evenings, sometimes aloud, taking turns with passages from Homer or Shakespeare. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about philosophy and politics, about dreams they'd once had, and dreams they were just beginning to imagine, and they grew closer in ways that transcended the physical. There was an intimacy in the small moments, the way Elena would reach out to adjust his collar before he went outside, the way Caleb would pull her close when she shivered despite the fire, the way they moved around each other in the small space of the cabin, with an ease that spoke of deep familiarity. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Eleanor tending to a small cut on Caleb's hand he'd gotten while chopping wood, he found himself watching her with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Her touch was gentle but confident, her fingers moving with practiced skill as she cleaned the wound and wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "I should be. I've had enough practice." She tied off the bandage and looked up at him. "I was a battlefield nurse, you know. Not just a hospital nurse. I volunteered to work at the aid stations near the fighting. That's dangerous work. Someone has to do it. And I was good at it." Her expression turned distant, remembering. "I saw terrible things. Men torn apart by bullets and shells. Boys crying for their mothers. Soldiers who'd lost everything but refused to stop fighting. But I also saw courage. Real courage. The kind that makes you believe people are capable of remarkable things. Is that where you learn to shoot? To track? Partly. You learn a lot when you're that close to combat. You learn to read situations, to move quickly, to stay calm when everything around you is chaos." She paused, her hands still holding his. "I learned that the difference between life and death is often just someone caring enough to try. Someone refusing to give up even when it seems hopeless." There was something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, that made Caleb's chest tighten. Like she was telling him something important, something he should understand but didn't quite grasp. "You saved a lot of lives," he said. "Some," she agreed softly. "The ones I could reach in time." That night, their relationship crossed another threshold. It happened naturally, inevitably. Two people who'd been circling each other, finally giving in to what they both wanted. Afterward, lying tangled together in the warmth of the bed, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Fragile and frightening, but real. "What are you thinking?" Elena asked, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "That I didn't expect this," he said honestly. "Any of this. Neither did I." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. "When I came here, I thought it would just be an arrangement. Protection in exchange for companionship. I didn't think I'd feel—" "What?" he asked when she trailed off. "Like I'd come home," she finished quietly. "Like maybe all the running, all the fear was leading me here. To you." He pulled her back down against him, holding her close. "I'm glad you came. Whatever happens, I want you to know that." "I know," she whispered. "I know." The peace lasted 3 more days. Then Sheriff Brennan rode up again, this time with news that changed everything. "They're coming," Tom said without preamble, his breath misting in the cold air. 5 men rode out of town this morning, headed this direction. They're not being subtle about it anymore. Caleb had been expecting this, but hearing it still sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. "How long do we have?" "They're on horseback, moving slow in the snow. I'd say they'll be here by tomorrow afternoon at the latest." "Did they say what they want?" Tom's expression was grim. "They showed me a wanted poster. Not for murder or theft like Elena said. It's a reward poster, offering $1,000 for information leading to her return. Claims she's a runaway wife who stole property from her husband." Elena, who'd been listening from the doorway, went pale. "That's a lie. I was never married to Cross. He wanted me to marry him, but I refused. That's when everything went wrong." "I figured it was something like that," Tom said. "But it gives them a legal pretense, thin as it is. They can claim they're pursuing a civil matter, retrieving stolen property and a runaway wife. Makes it harder for me to intervene, unless they trespass and threaten violence," Caleb said. "Unless that. But you'd have to prove it was self-defense if things go bad." "We will." Tom looked between them, his weathered face creased with worry. "I can stay. I can bring my deputies up here, make this official." "No," Caleb said firmly. "If you're here when it happens, Cross will use it against you. He'll claim you overstepped your authority, helped a criminal escape justice. I won't let you risk your position, but I can handle this, Tom. I know this mountain better than anyone. I know how to fight, and I have something worth fighting for." He glanced at Elena, who was watching him with eyes that held both fear and something fiercer. "We'll be all right." The sheriff wasn't happy about it, but he understood. Before he left, he pressed a piece of paper into Caleb's hand. "Federal Marshal's name and location in Cheyenne. If you survive this and need someone to take Cross down properly, send for him. He's a good man, and he owes me a favor." After Tom left, Caleb and Eleanor spent the rest of the day in final preparations. He showed her the defensive positions he'd established, the places where she should take cover if shooting started. He gave her his spare pistol and made her practice until she could load and fire without hesitation. "I don't want to kill anyone," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she held the weapon. "Neither do I. But if they come at us, if they try to take you, you do what you have to do to survive. You understand?" She nodded, her jaw set. "I understand." That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow in shades of red and gold, they stood together on the porch and looked out at the mountain. It was beautiful and harsh, indifferent to human struggles, enduring. Caleb had come here to hide from the world, to live in solitude and silence. Now he was preparing to fight for something he'd never expected to find, a reason to stay connected to life. "Tell me something," Elena said softly. "After all this is over, if we survive, what do you want? What does the future look like for you?" Caleb thought about it, surprised to find he actually had an answer. "This, the cabin, the mountain, but not alone anymore. I want to wake up every morning and know you're here. I want to build something lasting, something good. Maybe," he hesitated, then continued, "maybe even a family someday, if that's something you'd want." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I'd want that. More than anything." He kissed her then, gentle and deep, trying to pour into it all the things he hadn't learned how to say yet. When they broke apart, she rested her head against his chest, and he held her while the last light faded from the sky. "There's something I need to tell you," Elena said suddenly, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Something important. Before tomorrow, before everything, tell me," he said, sensing the weight of whatever she was carrying. But before she could speak, they both heard it, the distant sound of horses moving through the trees. Multiple horses, coming from the south, coming toward the cabin. Cross's men had arrived early. Caleb's hand went to his pistol. "Get inside, now!" They moved quickly, shutting and barring the door, extinguishing the lamps, leaving only the fire for light. Caleb positioned himself at the window with his rifle, and Elena took up position with the pistol near the back wall. The sound of hooves grew closer, then stopped. Caleb counted 5 distinct horses through the shutters. 5 men, just as Tom had said. They'd stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, just outside easy rifle range. Smart. They weren't rushing in blind. A voice called out, cultured and cold. "Mrs. Cross! We know you're in there. Mr. Cross has sent us to bring you home. Come out peacefully, and no one needs to get hurt." Elena's face had gone white, but her hands were steady on the pistol. They moved through the forest like ghosts, staying low, using the terrain and the smoke from the burning cabin as cover. Caleb led the way with the confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years learning every inch of this mountain. Elena followed close behind, her breathing controlled despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. The men were still gathered near the cabin, watching it burn. Caleb counted them now. All 5 were visible, which meant no one was circling around. They thought it was over. That was their first mistake. Caleb and Elena made it to a rocky outcropping that gave them high ground and cover. From here, they could see the full scene. The burning cabin, the 5 men, their horses picketed in the trees beyond. The wind was carrying the smoke away from them, but toward the men, making them cough and wipe their eyes. "We can't fight them head-on," Caleb said quietly. "But we don't have to. We separate them, take them one by one if we can. Make them afraid of what they can't see. You've done this before," Elena said. It wasn't a question. In another life. He studied the men, identifying the leader, the young one who'd done most of the talking. That one would be dangerous, would keep the others organized. But there was an older man standing apart from the group, looking nervous, uncomfortable. That was the weak link. Caleb waited. Patience was as much a weapon as any rifle. After 20 minutes, the older man walked into the trees, heading away from the group. Nature's call, probably. Caleb signaled to Elena to stay put and moved after him, silent as smoke. The man never saw him coming. One moment he was alone in the trees, and the next Caleb's arm was around his throat, cutting off air and sound. The man struggled briefly, then went limp. Not dead, just unconscious. Caleb dragged him deeper into the forest and tied him with strips of leather he'd grabbed from the cabin tunnel. When the man's eyes fluttered open, Caleb's knife was at his throat. "Make a sound, and it's the last one you make," Caleb said quietly. "Nod if you understand." The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. "Good. Now we're going to have a conversation." "Who hired you?" "Dalton Cross," the man gasped when Caleb eased the knife back slightly. "He's in New Mexico. Paid us $1,000 each to bring the woman back. Dead or alive. Alive if possible. Dead if necessary," the man swallowed hard. "But he wants the documents she took. That's what he really cares about." "What happens if you bring her back?" "She disappears." Cross has ways of making people disappear. "And anyone who helped her," the man's eyes pleaded. "Look, mister, I'm just hired help. This isn't personal. Let me go and I'll ride out of here. I won't come back. You'll forgive me if I don't trust that. I swear it. I didn't sign up to die on some frozen mountain." "The money isn't worth it," Caleb considered him. The man was terrified, genuine in his fear. He wasn't a hardened criminal, just someone who'd made a bad choice for money. "I'm going to give you a chance," Caleb said finally. "Your friends think you're dead or run off. Stay quiet for the next day, and when this is over, you walk away. Try to warn them or come after us, and I'll put a bullet through your skull. Clear? Crystal clear." "Thank you. Thank you." Caleb gagged him and moved back toward Elena's position. 4 men now instead of 5. Better odds. When he rejoined her, the remaining 4 men were searching the smoldering remains of the cabin, clearly looking for bodies. They weren't finding any, and confusion was setting in. "Where's Mitchell?" one of them called out. "Probably taking his time in the woods," another replied. "You know how he is," but the young leader wasn't satisfied. He was scanning the tree line, his hand on his pistol. "Something's wrong. The bodies should be in there, and Mitchell's been gone too long." "Maybe they got out," a third man said nervously. "Then we find them." The leader started giving orders, splitting the men up to search. "Reynolds, you check north. Carter, south. I'll go west. Stay in sight of each other. If you find them, fire 2 shots. They were spreading out, which played into Caleb's hands. But it also meant Elena was in more danger. He couldn't protect her and hunt the men at the same time. "Give me the documents," he said quietly. "What?" "Why? Because if they get past me and find you, I want you able to bargain for your life. Tell them you'll trade the documents for freedom. It might buy you time, and if they kill me anyway, then I'll make sure Cross never sees those documents, and I'll make sure he pays for what he's done." Caleb met her eyes. "But it won't come to that." "I won't let it." Eleanor pulled the saddlebag's false bottom open and extracted a oilskin packet. She handed it to him, and he secured it inside his coat. "Stay here," he said. "Stay hidden. No matter what you hear, don't move until I come back for you." "Caleb," he kissed her hard and fast. "Trust me." Then he was moving again, using the forest the way he'd been trained to use it. The man called Reynolds was heading north, away from the others, his rifle held ready, but his movements uncertain. "Easy target." Caleb let him pass, then stepped out behind him. "Drop the rifle." Reynolds spun, going for his pistol. Mistake. Caleb's rifle butt caught him in the temple, and he went down like a cut tree. Another one neutralized. 3 left. But the leader had heard the commotion. 2 gunshots rang out, not from finding Elena, but a signal. The remaining men were regrouping. Caleb moved to intercept, but as he rounded a boulder, he came face to face with Carter. They both froze, rifles pointed at each other, fingers on triggers. "Well," Carter said calmly, "this is a situation." "It is," Caleb agreed. "You're the mountain man. The one who married Cross's woman. She's not his woman. She's my wife. That's a matter of perspective." Carter was older than the others, maybe 50, with grey in his beard and scars on his face. A veteran. I've got no personal stake in this. I'm just here for the money. But I can't let you kill my employers and walk away. Then we've got a problem. They stood there, two men who'd both seen combat, both knowing that whoever moved first would likely die. The standoff stretched. Then Elena screamed. Caleb's attention flickered for just a split second, but it was enough. Carter's rifle moved, and Caleb threw himself sideways as the shot rang out. He hit the ground hard, his own rifle flying from his hands. Carter advanced, working the lever on his rifle for another shot. Caleb rolled, his hand finding his pistol, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The bullet took Carter in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second shot was more deliberate, hitting center mass. Carter went down and didn't get up. Caleb scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. Elena's scream. He ran toward where he'd left her, fear giving him speed despite the altitude and exertion. He found them at the outcropping. The young leader had Elena by the arm, his pistol pressed to her head. The fourth man stood nearby, rifle trained on the approach Caleb had to take. "There you are," the leader said with a cold smile. "I had a feeling you'd come running when she called out." Caleb stopped, his pistol aimed but useless. He couldn't shoot without risking hitting Elena. "Let her go!" "I don't think so. She's our ticket out of here, aren't you, sweetheart?" The leader jerked Elena closer. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop your weapons and step back. We're going to take Mrs. Cross, or is it Mrs. Stone now, and ride out of here. In a day or two, once we're clear, we'll let her go. Maybe. You're lying. Probably. But what choice do you have?" Caleb looked at Elena. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce, unafraid. And in them, he saw something that made his breath catch, recognition deeper than anything he'd seen before. Like she was looking at someone she'd known her whole life. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I should have told you before. I should have told you that 8 years ago, near the Mexican border, I found a dying soldier after an ambush. I hid him in an abandoned mission, nursed him back from the edge of death. For 2 weeks, I fought for his life while he burned with fever and called out names in his sleep. His call sign was Phantom. That soldier was you, Caleb." The words hit him like a physical blow. Memories rushed back, fragmented pieces suddenly fitting together. The gentle hands, the woman's voice, the feeling of being safe despite the pain. It had been her. All along it had been her. "You," he whispered. "I tracked you over the years," Elena continued, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to tell you, wanted to thank you for surviving, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd feel obligated to me. And then, when I needed help, when I was running, I came here because I knew you were a good man, because I'd seen you fight for life with everything you had. I came here because—" Her voice broke. "Because I fell in love with you 8 years ago, when I pulled you back from death, and I never stopped." The leader laughed. "How touching. A reunion. Too bad it ends with both of you dead." But something had changed in Caleb. The truth had unlocked something, had given him clarity he hadn't possessed before. This woman had saved his life, had loved him before she'd even known him, had risked everything to come to him when she needed help. He wasn't going to let her die. "You want to know why they called me Phantom?" Caleb said quietly. The leader's smile faltered. "What?" "Because I was already dead before I came for you." And then Caleb moved. The motion was born of desperation and training, the kind of calculated risk that could only come from a man with nothing left to lose. Caleb dropped straight down, firing as he fell. The bullet took the fourth man in the chest before he could adjust his aim. The leader's reflexes were good, but he made the critical error of trying to shoot Caleb instead of using Elena as a shield. Elena drove her elbow back into his ribs with surprising force. She'd been a battlefield nurse. She knew anatomy and twisted away from his grip. Caleb's second shot missed as the leader dove for cover, but it gave Elena time to scramble toward safety. She rolled behind a fallen log just as the leader returned fire, bullets chipping bark and stone around them. For a moment, there was silence. Caleb was pinned behind a boulder, Elena behind her log, and the leader somewhere in the rocks above them, with good cover and high ground. A stalemate, except that the leader had to know by now that his entire crew was gone. He was alone on a mountain against a man who knew every inch of terrain and had every reason to hunt him down. "You're good," the leader called out. "Better than I expected. Cross said you were just some broken-down hermit." Clearly, his intelligence was faulty. Caleb didn't respond, just watched and waited. The man was trying to locate him by voice. "But you're bleeding," the leader continued. "I can see it from here. That fall opened something up. How long before you pass out from blood loss?" Caleb glanced down. The leader was right. His side was wet with blood. The old war wound had torn open during the fall. He could feel the warmth spreading, the weakness that came with blood loss starting to creep through his limbs. He had minutes, maybe an hour if he was lucky, before his body gave out. But an hour could be a lifetime in combat. "Your name," Caleb called out. "I should know the name of the man I'm about to kill." A pause, then a laugh. "Marcus Webb, and I'm not the one dying today, old man." "We'll see about that, Marcus Webb." Caleb caught Elena's eye across the distance. She was pale but steady, her pistol in hand. He gestured, a series of hand signals he'd used in the war. She wouldn't know military signals, but she was smart. She'd understand the basic message: stay low, stay quiet, wait for my move. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Caleb began to move, slowly, using every bit of cover the rocks provided. The bleeding was bad, but he could work through it. He'd worked through worse. The key was to circle around, get above Webb, take away his advantage. But Webb was no fool. He'd positioned himself well, and he was watching all approaches. When Caleb tried to flank left, a bullet ricocheted off the stone near his head. He pulled back, breathing hard, fighting the dizziness that was starting to creep in. "Getting slower," Webb taunted. "I can wait, you know. Wait until you bleed out, then take the woman. Either way, I get paid." Elena's voice rang out, clear and strong. "The documents are gone, Webb. Caleb has them. If you kill him, they burn with him. Cross gets nothing. Then I'll take them off his corpse. Good luck finding him. This mountain has 1,000 places to hide a body. You could search for years." There was silence as Webb processed this. Elena had just changed the equation. Now Webb needed Caleb alive, at least long enough to retrieve the documents. It bought them time, but it also made the situation more complicated. "Smart woman," Webb called out. "But it doesn't change anything. Stone can't run forever, not in his condition. He needs medical attention. So here's my counteroffer. Stone comes out, hands over the documents, and I let you both live. I ride away, tell Cross the documents were destroyed in the fire, and everyone goes home happy. Except Cross sends more men," Caleb said. "Maybe, but that's a problem for another day. This day you get to keep breathing." Caleb looked at Elena again. She shook her head firmly. No deal. She'd rather die than let Cross get away with his crimes. And looking at her face, at the determination there, Caleb understood that she wasn't just running from a dangerous man. She was fighting for something bigger, for justice, for truth, for all the people Cross had hurt and would hurt if he wasn't stopped. She'd saved Caleb's life once. Now it was his turn to save hers, and maybe in doing so save a lot more. He checked his ammunition. 3 bullets left in the pistol. The rifle was somewhere back where he'd dropped it. 3 bullets against a well-positioned opponent who knew he was wounded and weakening. Not great odds, but he'd survived worse odds before. The memory came back fully now, triggered by Elena's revelation. The ambush, the bullets tearing through him, lying in the dirt, drowning in his own blood, certain he was dead. Then the hands, gentle but strong, dragging him to safety. The mission, cool stones against his fevered skin. The woman's face, young and determined, telling him he wasn't allowed to die. He remembered her voice singing in Spanish, soft songs that kept him anchored to life when he wanted to let go. He remembered her hands changing his bandages, the sting of herbs she used to fight infection. He remembered glimpses of her face through the fever, worried and fierce, and he remembered the moment the fever broke, when he'd opened his eyes fully for the first time and seen her clearly. She'd been crying, tears of relief streaming down her face, and she'd whispered, "You're going to live. Thank God you're going to live." Then he drifted back into sleep, and when he woke again much later, he was in a hospital, and she was gone. He'd asked about her, but no one knew anything. The locals who'd brought him in had disappeared. He'd thought perhaps he'd imagined her, a fever dream born of desperation, but she'd been real. Elena had been real, and she'd loved him even then, this stranger she'd fought death to save. The weight of that gift, of that sacrifice, settled over him. She'd given him his life. Now he would give her hers. "Webb," Caleb called out. "I'm coming out. But first, I want your word that Elena goes free. Whatever happens to me, she walks away." "Caleb, no!" Elena's voice was sharp with panic. "My word means nothing," Webb replied. "But I'll tell you this. I've got no interest in killing anyone who isn't necessary. I'm not cross. I'm just a man doing a job. Stone hands over the documents and surrenders, and I've got no reason to hurt the woman. It wasn't much of a guarantee, but it was something. And more importantly, it would get Webb to lower his guard, to think he'd won. That would be the opening Caleb needed." "All right," Caleb said. "I'm standing up." "Don't shoot. Slowly. Hands where I can see them." Caleb stood, his left hand raised, his right pressed against his bleeding side. The world swayed slightly, but he forced himself to stay upright. He could see Webb now, rising from his cover with his rifle trained on Caleb's chest. "The documents," Webb said. "Toss them over here." Caleb reached inside his coat with his right hand, moving carefully. His fingers found the oilskin packet. But they also found something else, a small derringer he kept hidden in an inside pocket. A last resort weapon, only 2 shots, but at close range it would do the job. "Don't try anything stupid," Webb warned, his eyes narrowed. "I can put 3 bullets in you before you hit the ground." "I know." "How long before the marshal can get here?" "A week, maybe less if I send an urgent telegram." "Send it tonight." Tom nodded, then looked at Elena. "And you, ma'am? Are you all right?" "I'm alive, thanks to my husband." She reached for Caleb's hand, threading her fingers through his. "We both are." That night, while Caleb rested in a room above the general store, Eleanor sat beside his bed and finally told him everything. The whole story, from the beginning. How she'd been traveling with a medical supply caravan when they'd come across the massacre site. How she'd found him barely breathing, had known she couldn't save all of them, but maybe she could save one. How she'd hidden him in the old mission and fought for his life every single day. "Why?" Caleb asked. "Why risk so much for a stranger?" "Because you were dying and I was a nurse," she said simply. "That's reason enough. But also," she hesitated, then continued, "when you were delirious with fever, you talked. About your life, your family, your dreams. You talked about wanting to find a place of peace, somewhere quiet where the war couldn't follow. And I thought, this man deserves to live. This good man deserves his chance at peace. And you found me again. I tracked you over the years. Knew you'd gone north. Knew you'd settled in Wyoming. I told myself I'd leave you alone, that you'd found your peace. But when I needed help, when I was running," her voice broke, "I came to you because some part of me always believed we were meant to find each other again." Caleb pulled her down beside him on the bed, ignoring the protest from his stitched side. We are. Everything that happened, everything that brought us here, it was all leading to this. You believe in fate. I believe in you. That's enough." They held each other as the night deepened, 2 people who'd been through fire and blood to find each other, who'd been given a second chance at something neither had dared hope for. Caleb pulled out the oilskin packet and held it up. "Here, take it." He tossed it toward Webb, a weak throw that made it land halfway between them. Webb hesitated, not wanting to lose his cover, but wanting the documents. Greed and caution warred on his face. Greed won. Webb stepped forward, keeping his rifle trained on Caleb, but bending to pick up the packet. That was when Caleb moved. The derringer came out fast, both barrels firing almost simultaneously. The range was longer than ideal, but one bullet caught Webb in the shoulder, spinning him around. His rifle fired wildly, the bullet going high. Caleb charged forward despite the weakness in his legs, despite the blood loss making everything distant and strange. He crashed into Webb, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs. Webb was younger, stronger, but Caleb had experience and desperation. They grappled on the cold ground, both trying for weapons. Webb's fingers found Caleb's throat, squeezing. Spots danced in Caleb's vision, the world going grey at the edges. Then Elena was there, her pistol pressed against Webb's temple. "Let him go," she said, her voice cold as winter. "Now." Webb's hands released immediately, and he rolled away, gasping. Caleb lay on his back, fighting for air, his vision swimming. Elena kept her pistol trained on Webb as she moved to Caleb's side. "Can you move?" "Give me a moment." Webb sat up slowly, his hands raised. Blood seeped from his shoulder wound, but it wasn't fatal. He looked at them both, at Elena's steady gun hand, at Caleb struggling to rise, and something shifted in his expression. "I surrender," he said quietly. "I'm done." "You win." "Smart choice," Elena said. She glanced at Caleb. "Can you tie him?" Caleb nodded, forcing himself to his feet despite the way the world tilted. He used Webb's own belt to bind the man's hands, tight enough to hold, but not tight enough to cut off circulation. He wasn't a torturer. "What now?" Webb asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "You can't keep me here forever." "And Cross will send more men eventually. Now we wait for help," Elena said. She looked at Caleb, her eyes full of worry. "And we get you proper medical attention before you bleed to death." Caleb checked the wound. It was bad, but not immediately fatal. He'd had worse. "I'll live." "I've survived worse, thanks to you." Their eyes met, and in that moment everything else fell away. Webb, the documents, Cross, the danger, none of it mattered as much as the truth between them. "You should have told me," Caleb said softly. "I know, I was afraid." "Of what?" "That you'd see me as an obligation rather than a choice. That you'd stay with me out of debt rather than desire." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I wanted you to choose me freely, not because you felt you owed me your life." Caleb reached out, cupping her face with his bloody hand. "Elena Vasquez Stone, I chose you the moment you asked to be my wife. Everything before that was just preparation for understanding why." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, tasting of salt and smoke and something that felt like forever. When they broke apart, Caleb turned to Webb. "You're going to help us. In exchange for your life and a lighter sentence, you're going to testify against Dalton Cross. You're going to tell everything you know about his operations, his crimes, his network." Webb considered this. "Cross has a long reach. He could have me killed in prison, maybe. Or maybe the federal government protects you in exchange for bringing down a traitor. Your choice. Take your chances with Cross or take your chances with us." Webb was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll talk. But I want it in writing, immunity and protection. We'll get you in front of a federal marshal," Elena said. "Sheriff Brennan knows one. A good man who can't be bought." As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of gold and red, they made their way back down the mountain. Caleb was weakening, leaning on Elena more with each step. Webb walked ahead of them, hands bound, rifleless, defeated. They found the man Caleb had tied earlier, still gagged and terrified, but alive. They released him with the same offer, testify or face charges. He agreed immediately. The cabin was gone, burned to its foundation, but Caleb found he didn't mourn it as much as he'd expected. It had been a hiding place, a refuge from the world. But he didn't need to hide anymore. He had something worth being in the world for. By the time they reached Redemption Ridge, full dark had fallen, and Caleb was barely conscious. Tom Brennan took one look at them, Elena supporting Caleb, the two bound prisoners walking ahead, and immediately sent for the doctor and began organizing help. Martha Hayes appeared, with blankets and hot coffee, clucking over them like a worried hen. "What happened up there?" "A reckoning," Elena said simply. "And a revelation." The doctor, a thin man named Carson, cleaned and stitched Caleb's wound, while Elena hovered nearby, offering professional advice that the doctor gratefully accepted. It turned out her nursing skills were as good as she'd claimed. "You'll live," Carson said finally. "But you need rest. Real rest, not mountain man rest. Weeks of it. We'll make sure he gets it," Elena promised. Tom pulled them aside once Caleb was bandaged and resting. What do you need from me? Caleb handed him the oilskin packet of documents. Contact that federal marshal you mentioned. These documents prove Dalton Cross is guilty of treason, murder, and a host of other crimes. The two men we brought in will testify in exchange for immunity. It's time to bring Cross down. Tom whistled low as he looked through the papers. This is serious. Federal government serious. I know. The journey to Denver took 3 days by train, a new experience for both of them. Elena had never been this far north, and Caleb hadn't been in a city since leaving the army. They held hands through most of the journey, drawing comfort from each other's presence as they moved toward the confrontation they'd been building toward. Marshal Halloran met them at the station looking satisfied. Cross's lawyers have been trying every trick they know, but the evidence is too strong. With your testimony and the witnesses we have, he's finished. The trial was held in a federal courthouse, an imposing building of stone and marble that spoke of the government's power and reach. Elena was nervous as they entered, her hand tight in Caleb's. You can do this, he said quietly. Just tell the truth. That's all they need. The courtroom was packed. Cross sat at the defense table, flanked by 3 expensive lawyers in suits that cost more than most men made in a year. He was a handsome man in his 40s, well-groomed and confident, looking more like a prosperous businessman than a traitor and murderer. When his eyes found Elena, something dark flickered across his face, but it was quickly masked. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. The documents Elena had stolen, authenticated by experts. Webb's testimony about being hired to retrieve her and silence her permanently. Mitchell's corroboration. Medical records showing men treated for wounds consistent with Cross's illegal operations. Then it was Elena's turn. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, was sworn in, and began to tell her story. She spoke clearly without dramatics, just laying out the facts. How she'd been coerced into providing medical care for Cross's men. How she'd witnessed him kill a business partner who'd discovered his treasonous activities. How she'd realized she had to gather evidence or become another victim. Cross's lawyers tried to shake her testimony, suggesting she was a scorned woman seeking revenge, that she'd been Cross's mistress who'd stolen from him out of spite. But Elena remained calm, answering each accusation with dignity and facts. I was never his mistress, she said firmly. I was his captive, forced to tend his wounded under threat of death. And when I learned the full extent of his crimes against this country, I knew I had a moral obligation to act. When asked about the documents, she explained in detail what they contained, how they proved Cross had been selling military intelligence to hostile forces along the border. Information that had directly resulted in American casualties. How many soldiers died because of the intelligence he sold? The prosecutor asked. Based on the documents and what I overheard, at least 30 confirmed deaths, possibly more. He was providing information about patrol routes, supply lines, troop movements. He might as well have been pulling the triggers himself. A murmur went through the courtroom. Even Cross's lawyers looked uncomfortable. Then Caleb was called to testify. He explained who he was, his military background, how Elena had come to him for help. He described the attack on his homestead, Cross's men attempting to murder them both to retrieve the documents. And you believe, the prosecutor asked, that Mr. Cross's intent was to silence your wife permanently? I know it was. His men said as much before we subdued them. Mrs. Stone wasn't just a witness to his crimes. She had evidence that could destroy him. He wanted her dead. Cross's lead lawyer stood for cross-examination, a silver-haired man with a voice like honey. Mr. Stone, isn't it true that you're a recluse who's lived isolated from society for 15 years? That you have no knowledge of business or legal matters? How can you be sure of Mr. Cross's intentions? Because I spent 20 years in military intelligence, Caleb said calmly. I know what it looks like when someone wants you dead. And I know what treason looks like. I've seen the documents. I've read the intelligence reports Cross sold. Men I served with probably died because of information he provided to the enemy. The lawyer tried several more approaches, But Caleb's testimony was solid, his military credentials unimpeachable. When he stepped down, he caught Cross's eye. The man was no longer looking confident. He was starting to look cornered. The trial lasted 3 days. More witnesses were called, more evidence presented. The defense tried to suggest Cross was being framed, that the documents were forgeries, that the witnesses were lying for immunity deals. But nothing stuck. The evidence was too overwhelming, the testimony too consistent. On the 3rd day, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts: treason, murder, conspiracy. A dozen other charges. Cross's face went white as the verdict was read. His lawyers immediately began talking about appeals, but everyone in the courtroom knew it was over. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too serious. Cross would hang, and his empire would crumble. As they filed out of the courtroom, Eleanor leaned against Caleb, shaking with relief. "It's done. It's really done. It is. You're safe now. We both are." That evening, Marshal Halloran hosted them for dinner at a nice restaurant, his way of thanking them for their courage. Over steaks and wine, he shared news that made them both smile. "The federal government is very grateful for your service. Mrs. Stone, there's talk of a reward, recognition of your courage in bringing a traitor to justice." "I don't need a reward," Elena said. "Justice is enough. Nevertheless, you'll receive one. And Mr. Stone, there's been discussion about offering you a position as a consultant, helping train federal marshals in tracking and wilderness survival. If you're interested." Caleb looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. "I might be. Let me think on it." They returned to Redemption Ridge as heroes, the story of their stand against Cross's men having spread through the territory. Martha threw them a celebration dinner, half the town showing up to congratulate them and hear the details of the trial. But the moment that mattered most came later, when they were alone in their room, holding each other in the quiet darkness. "What do we do now?" Elena asked. "We can do anything, go anywhere." "I know what I want to do," Caleb said. "I want to rebuild the cabin, make it bigger, better, a real home. And I want to fill it with life, with you, with children if we're blessed with them, with friends and family and all the things I thought I'd given up on." "That sounds perfect. And I want to take Halloran up on his offer, at least part-time. Use what I know to help people, to train men who'll protect others the way I tried to protect you. And I'll serve as the region's nurse, help people heal." Elena smiled. "We'll build something good together. Something worth all the pain it took to find each other." "We will," Caleb agreed. "We already have." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the world in white. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Caleb and Elena felt only warmth. Spring came to the Wyoming mountains like a promise kept. The snow melted, revealing the bones of the land beneath, and with the thaw came new life. Wildflowers pushed through the warming soil, aspens budded green, and the creeks ran full and clear with snowmelt. Caleb and Elena stood on the site where the old cabin had been, looking at the foundation they'd laid for the new one. It was larger than before, with room for a proper bedroom, a kitchen, space for Elena's medical supplies, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. They'd had help from the men of Redemption Ridge, Tom and others, coming up on weekends to assist with the heavy work. It was no longer a hermit's hideaway, but a home meant for living. "It's going to be beautiful," Eleanor said, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. "The baby would come in the fall. A new life, born from the love they'd fought so hard to protect." "It is," Caleb agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "Our home, our future." They'd been married 6 months now, though it felt like a lifetime and also like no time at all. The past months had been full of healing and building, healing from physical wounds and old emotional scars, building not just a cabin, but a life together. Caleb had accepted Halloran's offer, consulting with federal marshals 3 times so far, teaching tracking and survival skills to men who would use them to protect others. He found satisfaction in the work. in using his military knowledge for a purpose that felt redemptive rather than destructive. Elena had become indispensable to Redemption Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. She rode out to deliver babies, tend injuries, treat illnesses, carrying her medical bag and the knowledge that had saved so many lives. The community had embraced her, grateful for her skills and her compassionate nature. They'd heard from Marshal Halloran 2 weeks ago. Cross had been executed for treason, his last appeals denied. His criminal empire had collapsed, with dozens of his associates arrested or fled. The intelligence network he'd built to sell secrets had been dismantled, saving untold American lives. "Do you ever think about him?" Elena asked now, following Caleb's thoughts. "About Cross, about what happened?" "Sometimes. Mostly, I'm grateful it's over, that he can't hurt anyone else." Caleb looked at her. "Do you?" "I think about the lives he destroyed. The soldiers who died because of information he sold, the families he ruined." She paused. "But I also think about the good that came from stopping him. And I think about how his evil led me to you. I wouldn't wish anyone to suffer as I did, but I can't regret the path that brought us together." "Neither can I." They walked through the property, planning where to plant a garden, where to build a better barn, where their children might someday play. The mountain that had been Caleb's refuge from the world had become the foundation of a new life, one connected to community and purpose and love. As the sun began to set, painting the peaks in gold and crimson, they sat on a log where the porch would soon be, watching the light change. "Tell me again," Elena said softly, "about that moment in the old mission when you first really saw me." When the fever broke, Caleb smiled. It had become a ritual between them, this retelling of their story. "I opened my eyes, and you were there, backlit by sunlight coming through a broken window. You were crying, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I tried to speak, to thank you, but I was so weak. You put your hand on my forehead and told me I was going to live, and for the first time since the ambush, I believed it." "I was so afraid," Elena said. "Every day I thought I might lose you. You were so close to death for so long, but you didn't let me go. You held on when I couldn't hold on myself." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You gave me my life twice, Elena. Once in that mission, and once when you came to my mountain. Both times you saved me from dying, the first time from wounds, the second time from loneliness, and you saved me from Cross, from running, from being alone." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. A hawk circled overhead, riding the evening thermals. In the valley below, the lights of Redemption Ridge began to glow, warm points in the gathering dark. "Do you remember," Caleb said, "that first night when you asked if you could be my wife?" "I was terrified. Not of you, but of feeling anything again. Of letting someone in after so many years of walls, I remember. You looked at me like I'd asked you to jump off a cliff. It felt like that. Like stepping into empty air, not knowing if I'd fall or fly." He turned to face her fully. "But I flew, Elena. With you I flew." She kissed him, soft and sweet, then rested her forehead against his. "We both did." A month later, the cabin was finished. They moved in on a sunny June morning, carrying their few possessions up the mountain, with help from Tom, Martha, and a dozen others from town. Martha had brought curtains she'd sewn. Tom had built them a table, and others contributed quilts, dishes, tools, everything a young family would need. That evening, after everyone had left and they were alone in their new home, Caleb and Elena stood on the porch watching the sunset. It was the same view he'd watched alone for 15 years, but everything had changed. The isolation that had once felt like safety now felt like the prison it had been. This warmth beside him, this life growing inside Elena, this connection to community and purpose, this was freedom. "Happy?" Elena asked. "More than I ever thought possible," Caleb said honestly. "You?" "Completely." She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where their child moved beneath his palm. "Feel that?" That's our future, Caleb. That's the life we fought for. He felt the flutter of movement and his throat tightened with emotion. A child, their child. A life born not from violence and pain, but from love and hope, and two people who'd refused to give up on each other. "I love you," he said. The words still new on his tongue, but growing easier each time he said them. "I love you for saving my life. I love you for your courage. I love you for seeing something in me worth loving when I'd forgotten how to see it myself." "And I love you," Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her face, "for protecting me, for standing with me, for giving me a home and a future and a reason to believe in happy endings." They stood together as night fell over the mountain. Two people who'd been lost, finding themselves in each other. Two wounded souls, healing together. Two separate lives becoming one story. The mountain that had been Caleb's escape became their foundation. The violence that had brought them together transformed into peace. And the love that began in a hidden mission 8 years ago, tested by time and distance and danger, finally had room to grow into something lasting. In the years that followed, they would build a life rich with meaning. Children would be born, filling the cabin with laughter and life. Students would come to learn tracking and medicine, carrying forward the knowledge Caleb and Elena had to share. Friends would gather on that wide porch, sharing meals and stories and fellowship, but it all started here, on this spring evening, with a man who'd learned to live again, and a woman who'd taught him how. With two people who'd saved each other and chose, every day, to keep choosing each other. As they turned to go inside their new home, Elena paused and looked back at the darkening mountains. "Do you ever regret it? The solitude you gave up?" Caleb considered the question seriously, then shook his head. Solitude was survival, but it wasn't living. This, us, the baby, the community, all of it, this is living. And I wouldn't trade a single moment of it for all the peace and quiet in the world. "Good," Eleanor said with a smile, "because our baby is going to be loud, and our life is going to be messy. And it's going to be wonderful. I'm counting on it." They went inside together, closing the door on the past and opening themselves to the future. And if sometimes in quiet moments Caleb thought about the young woman who'd refused to let a dying soldier give up, who'd fought death itself to give him another chance, well, that was all right. She was here now, and she always would be. The mountains stood eternal under the stars, witness to endings and beginnings, to isolation and connection, to the strange and beautiful ways that love could survive anything when two people were brave enough to fight for it. And in the cabin that would become a home, Caleb and Elena Stone began writing the next chapter of their story, not with fear or regret, but with hope and gratitude for the unexpected grace that had brought them together. Sometimes the people who save us disappear before we can say thank you. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they come back and give us the chance to spend the rest of our lives showing them what their gift meant. Caleb Stone had been given that chance, and he would never stop being grateful for it.